When it comes to EU4 modifiers, there are some that steal the spotlight. Admin efficiency, discipline, and trade steering are all infamous for their ability to help you expand either your borders, your military might, or your economic strength. And while modifiers like spy network construction speed and global sailors may be considered situationally less useful, let's go with that phrase, well, they are still well known. But today I want to talk about 5 modifiers, starting with 1 or 2 that are pretty obscure but certainly known by some populations of EU4, and go all the way into the insanely random and obscure modifiers that are in some cases just straight up fundamentally broken, that I'm pretty sure even modders are for the most part not aware of. And before we begin with that, let's just get 2 quick things out of the way. A like on the video would be appreciated, and a subscription would be incredible. Anyway, we will start today with none other than hostile core creation cost on us, and the reason this enters in the number 5 slot is that despite the fact that it's literally not used in the modern game at all, it was quite notorious, for lack of a better word, within the older patches, and as such, older EU4 players are certainly going to recognize this modifier. Despite all of that said, it's not really used in modern mods as well. So even for modern players that see more obscure modifiers within special domains like mods like Ambernar that really pull out the plug on everything being used, they're still probably not going to see hostile core creation cost on us, as it's not really a helpful modifier for any kind of goal that you're trying to achieve. Now initially this was added as an aristocratic special idea group, as well as a bonus to specific groups such as Morocco and Tunis within the Barbary area, to make the expansion of nations such as Castile and Italian powers and Portugal more difficult into this area, as to be more, shall we say, for lack of a better word, historical. Unfortunately, it really doesn't prevent this. Hostile core creation cost on us, what it basically meant is that if we have this modifier and we own a province like Fez over here, well, when we have the hostile core creation cost on us unlocked, after a month tick, provinces where our cores exist gain an extra modifier for plus 100% local core creation cost, which means even if we lose this province, as long as our core exists and this nation has this idea set, we are going to make it more painful for everyone else to specifically core the province. However, it's actually quite simple to bypass. If you create a vassal in this area and just annex the vassal, you don't get exposed to this modifier. So it just restricted gameplay, as it basically meant the optimal way of expanding into certain areas such as the Barbary states, or into nations that have taken aristocratic ideas, was to make a vassal and use diplomatic ideas to annex them, bypassing the entire mechanic. It also just wasn't fun to play around. It just made it more expensive after you conquered the province, and unlike something like revanchism, which gave a comeback mechanism to a nation that lost wars, well, hostile core creation cost doesn't really help you. If I'm playing as Morocco and I lose a bunch of land to Portugal, the fact that Portugal had to spend more admin doesn't make my life and my recovery any easier. So it was removed. You're not going to see hostile core creation cost used within the current game at all, and very few mods, frankly, if any, ever use it. But with all that said, its notoriety within the older players is going to knock it down to 5th on the list of more obscure modifiers. With that, we move on to a modifier that is present in the modern game, but is very rarely given out, and I'm of course referring to morale damage taken by reserves. It's coded a bit weirdly. You actually want more morale damage to be taken by reserves. Normally, damage reductions are done in a negative manner. For example, shock damage received will be minus 15%. In this case, turn that plus into a minus for internal consistency, so plus 100% reduced morale damage taken is not taking any morale damage when you're in reserves. What does this actually mean? Well, combat width is 20 at the technology level of 3, and in this case, because I cheated in Tech 5 and gave myself an extra 2 combat width, we have a combat width of 22. Shall we say you go into the battle with 30,000 men, you're going to have an extra 8,000 men in the battle that are not in the front row. They're going to go into something called the reserves. As those troops are sitting in the reserves and the battle's going around, they're going to take morale damage just from being in the reserves, meaning they're going to enter the battle on a lower morale than if they just stood outside of the battle and reinforced. This is why there's a whole reinforced meta for multiplayer, and even in single player, when you're fighting millions versus millions battles against the AI. The AI doesn't understand the reinforcement meta and will just pile on their troops to sit in reserves and take morale damage. So this is how reinforcing properly can let you earn wins that when you really shouldn't. Anyway, morale damage reduction taken by reserves being reduced by up to 100% basically removes this mechanic, allowing troops to sit in reserve without taking morale damage. This naturally is quite powerful, meaning that outside of some mods like Ambernar, of the more mainline ones that give morale damage reduction taken by reserves to things like the Undead Army to make them play like a big blob that just walks around and smacks everything and doesn't have to worry about reinforcement, well, a lot of the EU4 game itself kind of relies on the fact that reserves take morale damage, so reducing them really changes fundamentally how the game behaves. So much so that, indeed, in the modern game, there are 2 sources of reduced morale damage taken by reserves. The one that you may recognize, and the reason it earns the 4th spot and not a more obscure one, is actually going to be the permanent army, as this reduces your morale damage taken by reserves by 50%. There is also a government reform that reduces it by 15%, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. I'm going to leave that as an exercise to the reader. With that said, let's move on to the third modifier, and I'm of course referring to a modifier that was given to England for exactly one patch before it was removed for being completely busted, but it does mean that it's still in the game, and that is naval engagement cost reduction, seen here in this screenshot. Now, England in the modern patch has a very good custom ship. Namely, expanding their own navy gives them man of war ships which have nice morale damage dealt buffs and make them quite strong. But these man of war ships used to be called ships of the line, and were, as you can see, absolutely broken, as normally heavy ships take 3 combat widths to fight, galleys take 1, and light ships and transports also take 1, meaning that you would be able to, on a combat width of 30, fit in 10 heavy ships or 30 galleys. But the English ships of the line with their -1 engagement width used to be able to fit 15 instead of 10 ships into the battle, which was absolutely broken and absolutely busted, making England win every single naval war even harder. This was naturally removed, however the modifier itself remained in the game, and unless you're around for this one very small patch or were even aware of this modifier existing from modding, I severely doubt you would ever be exposed to it, as most mainline mods that a lot of people do play are also smart enough to recognize just how completely busted reducing the naval engagement width of a ship is going to be, and hence it's practically never used as well. While this modifier though may not see use in the modern day because it's completely overpowered and completely broken and also completely wrong localized, that should not be a red reduction, that should be a green reduction because it's a positive modifier. Let's look at something that is in the game but isn't used because it's absolutely useless. I'm of course referring to this modifier here, which gives you no maintenance on exploring leaders. What does this actually mean? Well, as you can see here, you have a cap of how many naval and military leaders you're allowed to have. So we currently have 1 admiral and all as well, but if we go ahead and hire 2 more admirals, as you can see we're going to get the pop-up that we have too many military leaders, and that's going to cost us an extra diplomatic point each month because we're over leader capacity, unless we take our 1 current leader and send him out to explore. At which point, because he's exploring, well, you can see it immediately, we are no longer over the leader cap. When this guy comes back from exploration, and we can manually cancel this exploration right now, just so we can demonstrate it, cancel the exploration, he's going to cost us monarch points again. It doesn't update on the month tick, which makes it quite unusual as a list of modifiers, because normally these things do tend to wait at least a month tick, so it's probably not good for lag as well, as this one seems to be one of those daily updating modifiers. But it's also just really weird and really clunky to use. It doesn't actually let you have an extra leader, and any modifier that gives you +1 leader cap is just objectively better than this modifier, because to effectively use it, you need to have an explorer that is exploring 24/7, and if he ever stops exploring, the modifier does nothing. You're not normally going to be in a situation where you have an explorer exploring 24/7, because the way exploration tends to work is that you get some colonial range or some new colony finishes, you go and explore for a bit, then the explorer sits around waiting for another colony or another conquest to finish to give you more colonial range. Which means that because it's an on and off going system, this doesn't actually give you any extra leader slots. And even if it would give you an extra leader slot, not really. I mean, it's an inconsistent one, and +1 leader capacity is not really a strong modifier. I mean, it's nice to have, but it's not something that people form 50 countries over just to get +1 leader capacity, right? And I think for that reason, this modifier is just not really used. It's very clunky to demonstrate, and no real mod or thing benefits from it. The only thing I can think of to make this work is if you create a custom scenario where you're playing someone like Portugal and Castile and Aragon, and you reduce all the other countries where Europe basically doesn't exist, and you make the new world like 50 billion times bigger. And so what you will then have is loads of exploration to do, and so you'd hire like 50 leaders, but you have to make sure they're constantly exploring. And the moment you're done exploration, you can fire them. So it's a good way of making people be able to afford like 20 leaders in the field without necessarily giving them +20 leader capacity. For this very obscure scenario that I've described of some kind of total conversion mod, I can see it working. Beyond that, this is pretty useless, which is probably why it's completely unseen, but at least this modifier functions as intended, which is not something you can say for the next one, as this modifier is so old and so absolutely broken that its icon doesn't even work. In fact, the question mark icon you can see here is even smaller than the other pop-up icons, so it's just really showing its age. And I'm of course talking about a local province modifier, namely the local yearly inflation reduction of 10%, not minus 0.1 or something, 10% yearly inflation reduction. And if we take some loans here, so I've taken 2 loans to give ourselves 0.2 inflation, as you can see here, it does technically work. So you'd think this would work in the way that if you own a province that has this modifier, so if Castile were to own this province, or Aragon would own this province, they would get this modifier for minus 0.1 1% yearly inflation reduction. It's localized a bit weirdly. Normally expect to see minus 0.1 instead of 10 plus 10% yearly inflation reduction, but that would be, that would be how you expect it to work. But no, of course it's not. It's a paradox modifier. It's an old, very broken paradox modifier, which is never used, and you're about to see why. Because if we tag into something like Aragon here, and we decide to put Navarra out of their misery, giving us access to this province modifier, well, first of all, it actually disappears on province conquest. So if it does exist somewhere out, given by a mission or something, it just goes away. But if we add it back in, say you would get a mission from a mod that would give it to you. I mean, Paradox is probably going to have to fix this modifier before they put it in some of their own mission rewards, but if a mod decided to give you this province modifier, well, this province modifier, because it's a local inflation modifier, scales with your total province count. So now on Aragon, as you can see, because we have so many other provinces, our actual total inflation reduction is significantly lower. Indeed, if we go and release Bay as Navarra again, which means, of course, we have to give ourselves the modifier again to see it, if we expand with one extra province that doesn't have the province modifier, instead of disappearing or working in any weird way that expected to work, it halves it, meaning that the total inflation reduction you have is then modified by your total province count depending on the level of this modifier. So I tested this earlier and messed around with some other numbers. If I made this give you instead of 10%, 20% yearly inflation reduction, it would mean that if you go to 2 provinces, this goes down to 0.1. So it halves. And if you have 3 provinces on a 0.3, and only one of them has this modifier, becomes 0.1 again. It's a weird mess. It's a ratio of total local yearly inflation reduction modifiers compared to everything else. What's going on here and what the design decision behind this modifier is just a question I'm not going to ask, but I don't think I've ever really seen this one out of testing. I don't think this is even really in an official patch of EU4 in any capacity that you can go back to, or one that I could find, and it's certainly not being used by any other mod. It exists on the list of modifiers that are in the game and are coded, but it's clearly very broken. Again, there's a question mark, because how is this meant to work? We don't know. But at the same time, like, what does this do? And its actual intended use is a bit up in the arms. Yearly inflation reduction as a modifier works exactly as how you'd expect this modifier to work. And it's also, again, still localized a bit weirdly, because what does plus 10% yearly inflation reduction actually mean? At least as minus 0.1 kind of made more sense. But anyway, enough of a weird complaint about this older banner modifier. Someone probably had fun making it and just kind of left it in there. So no one's seen the light of day until, I guess, now. But that is certainly going to be winning the award for the most obscure modifier that I have found for this video. But with that said, that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to my channel members, especially Ark, Soda, Slemen, W Haste, Sebastian Haller, Chundok 2.0, Nick Huss, Duck Fortuna, Big Salad, Leb Joss, Gay Fug, Vocal Knorse, Golden Arrows, Nan Hatan, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Pro Gaming, Grand Admiral Flavia, Kono, and Andrea Salberg.